Hey guys, welcome back to Sleep into Power. I am NJ. This sleep documentary is going to be incredible. Just imagine London. The year is 1582. The river is black and slow, and the mist has come up off the water, the way it always does after dark, curling around the boats moored at the stairs, softening the shapes of the houses until they seem half remembered rather than half seen. Somewhere across the city, a church bell counts out the hour, and the sound arrives late and thin, as though it has had to travel a long way to reach you. And in a modest house at Mortlake, upriver from the noise and the smoke, a candle is still burning behind a leaded window. Inside that house, there are more books than in either of England's great universities. There are celestial globes and brass astrolabes, sea charts marked with coastlines that no Englishman has yet walked, a crystal set upon a table of wax, and a mirror of polished black stone that came out of Mexico and shows nothing at all except the face of whoever leans towards it. And there is a man in his 50s, bearded, quiet, immensely learned, bending close to the page. His name is John Dee. Before we begin, a word or two, and then I shall leave you in peace for the rest of the night. If you enjoy these long-form documentaries, you may also enjoy my book, Sleep into Power, which is available on Amazon in paperback and on Kindle. It explores how to rewire your mind and learn how powerful sleep is in order to manifest your new and desired reality. You can also listen to these documentaries on Spotify if you would rather rest your eyes entirely. And if you are looking for guided meditations, ambient journeys, and long, peaceful soundscapes, do visit my second channel, Meditate into Power. If you would like to help support future documentaries, you can do so through Buy Me a Coffee. Every contribution keeps these journeys being made, and I am grateful for everyone. And if you are new here, and you enjoy long, slow history in the dark, consider subscribing. It helps this small channel more than you know. Now, a personal word. Tonight's subject was suggested by one of you. Somebody wrote to me some months ago and said, quite simply, you should do John Dee, and then added that they had been trying to explain him to a friend for years and had never quite managed it. I have thought about that ever since. You know who you are, and thank you. And thank you to those of you who leave a comment every single week, without fail, on every episode, whatever the subject. You know who you are as well. This channel is made of you. And wherever you are listening from tonight, in a city where it is already the small hours, or somewhere it is still only early evening and the light has not quite gone, or on a night shift where the building has emptied and the sound of this is the only company in the room, thank you for being here. Different clocks, same quiet. So, lower the lights, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, find whatever position you intend to stay in. You do not need to follow every detail. You do not need to remember any of it. If you drift away in the middle and wake up somewhere near the end, that is exactly what this is for. We are going back to Elizabethan England, to a house full of books beside a cold river, to a man who could calculate the position of a star, advise a queen, design the navigation of an empire, and then sit down in a locked room and try to speak with angels. And to the question that has followed him for 400 years, was John Dee one of the founding minds of English science? Or was he the last great magician of the Middle Ages? Or is it possible, and this is the truly interesting thought, that in the 16th century, there was no difference between the two at all? Settle in, let us begin. To understand a man, it helps to understand the weather of the world he arrived in. John Dee was born in London on the 13th of July, 1527, and baptized at the parish church of St. Dunstan in the east, in the ward of the Tower. If you had stood in that parish on the morning of his baptism, you would have smelled the river and tar and wood smoke, and the particular sourness of a city that had not yet worked out what to do with its own waste. You would have heard hammering from the shipyards. You would have seen the white tower standing pale above the rooftops, the same stone it had been for 4.5 centuries, and you would not have thought anything of it, because it had always been there. England in 1527 was a small country on the wrong edge of Europe. That is worth saying plainly, because it is almost impossible for us to feel it now. The great powers were Spain and France. The great wealth was Spanish silver coming out of the Americas. The great cities were Venice, Antwerp, Paris, Rome. London was a provincial town of perhaps 60,000 people, wealthy by English standards and unimportant by anybody else's. English ships fished. They traded wool to the Low Countries. They did not cross oceans. There was no English colony anywhere on earth. There was no English navy in any modern sense. There was no such thing as a British Empire, and nobody had ever spoken the phrase. Within John Dee's lifetime, all of that would begin to change, and he would be, in ways we will come to, one of the people who changed it. His father was Roland Dee, a mercer, a dealer in fine cloth, and a gentleman's sewer at the court of Henry VIII, which was a minor household office involving the ceremony of the king's table. It was not power, it was proximity to power, which in Tudor England was its own kind of currency. It meant the Dees were not grand, but they were not nobodies either. They lived at the edge of the court's light. The family was Welsh in origin, and John Dee would remain proud of that all his life, tracing his ancestry back through Welsh princes, and, eventually, with more enthusiasm than evidence, all the way to legendary British kings. The name itself is thought to come from the Welsh du, meaning black. Historians have noted, with some amusement, that a man named for darkness would spend his later years staring into a black mirror. That is a coincidence rather than a clue. But it is a good one. Now think about what happened to England while this boy was learning to read. In 1533, when Dee was 6, Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn and broke with Rome. In 1534, he made himself supreme head of the church in England. And between 1536 and 1541, when Dee was between 9 and 14, the monasteries of England were dissolved. We tend to remember the dissolution as a matter of land and money, and it was. Vast estates changed hands. Fortunes were made. But it was also, and this is the part that mattered for a boy like John Dee, the largest destruction of books in English history. The monastic libraries held the accumulated written memory of the country. Chronicles, theology, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, copies of classical works that existed nowhere else, manuscripts that had been copied and recopied by hand for 800 years. When the houses were broken up, some of those books were rescued by scholars and collectors. Some were sold to the trade. Many were used to wrap goods, to line pie dishes, to polish boots, to stiffen the bindings of newer books, to light fires. Whole libraries went for scrap. An antiquary of the period recorded seeing merchants buying manuscripts by the cartload for use as packing material. Others were shipped abroad by the shipful. It was not malice exactly. It was indifference. The books were the property of an institution that no longer existed, written in a language most people could not read, on a subject the state had just declared to be wrong. John Dee grew up in the aftermath of that, and it left a mark on him that never faded, because here is the thing about Dee that explains a great deal of what follows. He was, before he was anything else, a man who could not bear the loss of knowledge, not the theft of it, the loss. The idea that something had been written down, once, by somebody who understood it, and was now simply gone, and could not be recovered by any effort, was to him a kind of ongoing catastrophe. He spent his life trying to gather back up what had been scattered, and when he could not find it on earth, he would eventually try to ask heaven for it directly. That is the thread. Hold on to it. Everything that seems strange about him later runs back to this. Of his childhood itself, we know very little. This is common for the period, and it is worth saying, because it is the first of many silences we shall meet tonight. We know the year and day of his birth because he was an astrologer and cared about such things and wrote them down. We do not know what his mother's household was like, or whether he was a solitary child, or what he was afraid of. Historians who tell you otherwise are filling in the shape of a person from the outline they left in the records. We do know he was sent to school at Chelmsford in Essex, to the Chantry school there, and that he learned Latin thoroughly, as every educated boy did, because Latin was not a subject in the 16th century. It was the road. Nothing serious could be reached without it. And we know that in 1542, at the age of 15, he went up to St. John's College, Cambridge. Picture the journey. A boy on a horse, or more likely walking beside a carrier's cart, out of London, on the road northeast, through flat country, under a big sky, past the harvest, past churches with their images newly whitewashed over, into the fens. 2 days, perhaps 3, the towers of Cambridge appearing over the fields. He arrived with a small box of clothes and a good grounding in grammar. He would leave as one of the most alarming young intellects in England. Outside, the river runs on, past Mortlake in the dark. We shall come back to it. Dee left an account of his own Cambridge years, written much later, and it is one of the more revealing things he ever put on paper. He recorded that he slept 4 hours a night. 2 hours he allowed for meals, and for what he called necessaries. The remaining 18 hours, every day, he spent studying. Take a moment with that. 18 hours. Not for a week before an examination. As a routine. For years. You may want to be skeptical, and a certain amount of skepticism is healthy, because this is a man describing his own youth to justify his later reputation. But everything else we know about him is consistent with it. He read Greek at a level that made him useful to scholars twice his age within 4 years. He worked through the mathematics of the ancient world, and then went looking for more. When he later listed the books he wanted, the instruments he wanted, the correspondence he wanted, the lists were never short. This was a person with an appetite that could not be satisfied, only occupied. He took his bachelor's degree in 1545 or 1546, and in 1546, when Henry VIII founded Trinity College, John Dee was made one of its original fellows, at the age of 19, and appointed under reader in Greek. And it was at Trinity that he did the thing that would follow him for the rest of his life. The students put on a play. This was ordinary. Colleges staged Greek and Latin drama as an exercise in the languages, and the audience was the college itself, the fellows and scholars, perhaps a few visitors. The play chosen was the Peace of Aristophanes, a comedy of the 5th century before Christ, and it contains a scene in which a character flies up to the heavens on the back of an enormous dung beetle to petition the gods. Now, ordinarily you would do this cheaply. Somebody would carry a painted beetle across the stage. Everybody would laugh, because everybody was meant to laugh, and then you would get on with it. John Dee did not do it cheaply. Dee, who had been reading his ancient mechanics, his Hero of Alexandria, his practical geometry, his treatises on weights and pulleys, built a machine. He rigged the hall. He worked out the loads and the counterweights and the lines. And on the night, in front of the assembled college, a man climbed onto the back of a great beetle, and the beetle rose, with him on it, up into the air, off the stage, and up towards the roof of the hall, carrying a basket and a cargo of stage properties as it went. It flew. Some of the audience, according to the accounts, were badly frightened. And here we arrive at the first great misunderstanding of John Dee's life, which is also, in miniature, the misunderstanding of his entire century. He had done geometry. He had done applied mathematics. He had taken a set of principles that had been written down over 1,000 years earlier, understood them, and used them to produce a physical effect in the world. To Dee, this was engineering, and rather good engineering, and he was proud of it, and he had every right to be. To a substantial portion of the audience, a man had made something fly. And the words available in 1546, "for a man who makes something fly," were not engineering words. They were conjuring words. Necromancy, magic, dealing with spirits. Dee wrote about this decades afterwards, and you can still feel the irritation coming off the page. He complained bitterly that the reputation of being a conjurer was fastened on him then and never came off, and that it had cost him. He was right. It never did come off. 480 years later, in a search engine, John Dee is still the magician first. But notice what this incident actually tells us. It tells us that in the middle of the 16th century, the boundary we now draw so confidently between science and magic did not exist. Not because people were stupid, because the evidence did not yet support the boundary. Think about it from their side of the room. You are sitting in a college hall in Cambridge. You have seen conjurers at fairs. You have heard sermons about spirits. You know, as an educated fact, that the heavens are moved by intelligences. And now a 19-year-old fellow of the college, notoriously secretive, notoriously learned, has caused a large object to ascend into the air by means he has not explained. What, precisely, is your evidence that this is one category of thing rather than the other? You do not have any. Neither did anybody else. The tools for telling those two things apart, the shared method, the published experiment, the demand that a claim be reproducible by strangers, had not been invented. They were, in fact, going to be invented partly by men like Dee over the following century and a half, and Dee would not live to see it. So when we look back at him and ask, was he a scientist or a magician, we are asking a question in a vocabulary he did not possess. It is a little like asking whether a medieval builder was an architect or an engineer. He was a mason. The distinction came later, and it came out of the work. He left Cambridge unsatisfied. That too is a pattern. Cambridge in the 1540s was a fine place to learn Greek, and a poor place to learn mathematics. There were no chairs in the subject. There was little interest. The mathematical arts were regarded by many as beneath a gentleman, useful for merchants and gunners and surveyors, and therefore not quite respectable. The best mathematicians in Europe were not in England. They were in the Low Countries. And so in 1547, and then more seriously from 1548, John Dee went abroad. Picture him on the crossing, 20 years old, in the belly of a small ship, in weather, the English coast dropping away behind. A young man with almost no money, going to find the people who knew the things he wanted to know. He is heading for Louvain. Rest your head a little heavier where it is. There is nothing to do for a while but travel. Louvain in what is now Belgium was in the 1540s one of the most interesting places on earth, and almost nobody remembers it. It was a university town, old and Catholic and crowded, but around its edges, something new was happening. A group of men there were doing work that would quietly reorganize the world. They were making maps. That sentence does not sound dramatic. Let me put it another way. They were working out how to represent a sphere on a flat surface with sufficient accuracy that a ship could leave a port with a piece of paper and arrive somewhere it had intended to go. They were building instruments to measure angles precisely enough that positions on land could be fixed by triangulation. They were, in effect, converting the surface of the planet into numbers. Everything that follows in the age of European expansion, for good and very often for ill, runs through that workshop. Dee arrived and found his people. There was Gemma Frisius, physician, mathematician, instrument maker, the man who had described the principle of triangulation for surveying, and who had grasped, decades before it was practical, that if you could carry an accurate clock aboard a ship, you could find your longitude. There was Gerardus Mercator, then in his 30s, a superb engraver and globe maker, whose great projection was still years away, but whose mind was already bent on the problem. There was, in Dee's circle over time, Abraham Ortelius, who would produce the first modern atlas. And there was Pedro Nunes, the Portuguese royal cosmographer, one of the finest mathematical navigators alive, with whom Dee formed a bond so strong that decades later he would name Nunes in his will. Dee and Mercator became close friends. Dee later wrote that for a period, the two of them were scarcely apart, for 3 whole days together. They talked, argued, drew, calculated. When Dee eventually went home, Mercator gave him instruments and globes to take with him. Now, hold 2 things in your mind at once here, because they are both true, and we keep wanting them to be separate. These men were doing the most rigorous quantitative work being done anywhere in Europe. Gemma Frisius was a serious empirical scientist by any definition you care to use. Gemma Frisius also cast horoscopes. So did Mercator, who was arrested for heresy in 1544 and only narrowly released. So did almost every mathematician of the age, because astrology was where the money and the patronage were, and because, and this is the part that we consistently fail to feel, astrology was not obviously wrong yet. Consider the argument as a 16th century natural philosopher would have made it. The sun is a heavenly body. Its position through the year changes everything on Earth. The temperature, the crops, the length of the day, the behavior of animals, the health of people. That is not superstition, it is observation. The moon is a heavenly body. It moves the sea. Twice a day. Anybody standing on a beach can verify it. So the influence of celestial bodies upon terrestrial affairs is not a hypothesis. It is established fact. The only remaining question is how far the effect extends, and which bodies produce it. Given the sun and the moon, why would Mars be inert? That is a bad argument. We know it is a bad argument. But it is a bad argument of a particular kind, the kind that requires a great deal of subsequent work to refute, and the work had not been done. Dee's whole intellectual world sits inside that gap, and if you can hold that in mind, he stops looking foolish and starts looking like a man reasoning carefully from the best available premises. In 1550, at the age of 23, John Dee went to Paris, and what happened there was, by the standards of academic life in any century, extraordinary. He offered to give public lectures on Euclid, free, on the elements, the geometry text that had come down from Alexandria around 300 years before Christ, and specifically, according to his own account, on the more difficult later books that were rarely taught. The lecture hall at the College of Reims could not hold the audience. Students climbed the outside of the building and hung at the windows to hear him. Dee, writing about it long afterwards, was still quietly thrilled, and made a point of mentioning that a great many men of great learning came, and that this had never been done before in that university, by any man, of any nation. He was offered a position. He turned it down. He was offered positions later too, from Oxford, from foreign courts, and he turned those down as well. This is a pattern in Dee's life, and it is a slightly tragic one. He wanted royal patronage in England. He wanted to be the philosopher of his own country. He wanted, one senses, to be needed at home. And England, over and over, would take his advice, use his knowledge, borrow his books, and fail to pay him properly for any of it. But in 1550, none of that had happened yet. He was 23 years old, standing in front of a packed hall in Paris, explaining the geometry of solids to men who had climbed a wall to hear him. It is worth pausing on that image before we go on. It is one of the few unambiguously happy scenes in a long and complicated life. Let the room settle around you. Somewhere, a shutter is loose in the wind and knocking gently against a frame, and nobody is going to get up and fix it tonight. He came home to England in 1551. He was 24. He had the friendship of the best geographers in Europe. He had instruments nobody in England had seen, and he had a plan. What he did not have, and would never quite manage to acquire, was money. The England he returned to was in the middle of a religious revolution, and the king was 14 years old. Henry VIII had died in 1547. His son Edward VI was a bright, cold, thoroughly Protestant boy, surrounded by ambitious men, and under his regency, the Reformation in England went much further than his father had ever intended. Altars came down, wall paintings were whitewashed, stained glass was smashed, the old ceremonies were abolished, and the churches, which had been dim and gold and full of color and images, became white and plain and echoing. Into this arrived a young man with globes. Dee did well at first. He was introduced at court, presented some of his work, and was noticed. He received a pension from the crown, and later the rectory of Upton upon Severn in exchange for it, which was an ordinary way of paying a layman in a country where the church still held most of the endowed income. He entered the household orbit of the Duke of Northumberland, the most powerful man in the kingdom, as a tutor to his children. One of those children was Robert Dudley. Remember that name. The boy Dee tutored would grow up to be the Earl of Leicester, and the great love, or at any rate the great favourite, of Queen Elizabeth. 30 years of Dee's access to power would run through that relationship. This is worth stopping on, because it explains something about how Dee's career actually worked, and it is not how we tend to imagine such things. Dee never held high office. He was never a minister, never a bishop, never a member of the Privy Council. He had no institutional base at all. What he had was a network. He knew people. He had taught their sons, cast their horoscopes, mended their instruments, answered their questions about the tides and the stars and the calendar. He was the man you sent for when you had a problem that nobody else in England could solve, which is a wonderful position to occupy intellectually, and a catastrophic one financially, because the man you send for when there is a problem is not on the payroll. He is paid, when he is paid, in gifts and in promises, and in the vague expectation of future favor. Dee spent 50 years being the most useful man in England, and being not quite paid for it. In these Edwardian years, he was also doing real work. He was writing on astronomy and on the tides. He was corresponding with continental scholars. He was accumulating books, always books, buying what he could afford, and copying what he could not. And he was thinking about a problem that would become central to him, which is the problem of how the heavens act upon the earth. His conclusion, developed over years and eventually published in 1558 as the Propaediomata Aphoristica, or Aphoristic Preliminaries, is genuinely fascinating, and it is one of the clearest windows we have into how a mind like his worked. Dee proposed that every body in the universe emits rays, not metaphorically, physically, rays that travel outward in all directions and act upon whatever they strike, the way light does, the way heat does, the way, as he understood it, a magnet does. The influence of a star upon the earth was therefore not a spooky sympathy or a divine message. It was a physical force, propagating through space, obeying geometrical rules, and because it obeyed geometrical rules, it could be calculated. Do you see what he is doing there? He is trying to take astrology, which in his day is a jumble of tradition and rule of thumb and inherited authority, and put it on a mathematical footing. He wants to strip out the mumbo-jumbo and leave a physics of celestial influence, computable, precise, testable in principle. He is wrong. There is no such force. The entire edifice rests on a foundation that is not there. But the instinct is the instinct of a scientist. Take the phenomenon, find the underlying quantitative law, reduce the mystery to geometry, and there is a strange footnote here that historians of science enjoy. Dee's insistence on rays acting according to the inverse of distance, his concern with how the strength of an influence falls off as it spreads through space, sits in the same neighborhood of thought that would eventually produce the inverse square law. He did not get there. He did not have the mathematics, or the experiments, or the concept of gravity as a universal force. But he was standing in the right field, looking in roughly the right direction, in 1558. Then, in 1553, Edward VI died at 15 of what was probably tuberculosis. And everything turned over. Northumberland, Dee's patron, attempted to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne. The attempt collapsed in 9 days. Northumberland was executed. His sons, including young Robert Dudley, whom Dee had taught, went to the Tower under sentence of death. And Mary Tudor, Catholic, 47 years old, daughter of the wife Henry had discarded, came to the throne determined to return England to Rome. For John Dee, aged 26, with his patron's head on a pike and his entire network in prison or in hiding, this was not a good moment. It was about to get considerably worse. The candle is low, let it burn. There is a long way still to go, and no need at all to hurry. In the summer of 1555, John Dee was arrested. The charge, in the language of the time, was calculating. It is a wonderfully bland word for what was actually alleged, which was this: that Dee had cast the horoscopes of Queen Mary and of her half-sister the Princess Elizabeth, that he had, in doing so, calculated the length of the Queen's life, and that he had gone further and attempted, by enchantment, to kill her. Consider how frightening that combination is. Casting the monarch's nativity was in itself close to treason, because a horoscope of a reigning sovereign implies a date of death, and to speculate on the death of the sovereign was to imagine the succession, and to imagine the succession was to conspire. Add the accusation of enchantment, and you have a capital case. The informant appears to have been a man named George Ferrys, who claimed, among other things, that Dee's magic had struck one of his children blind and killed another. 2 of Dee's associates were examined. Dee was taken. He was brought before the Star Chamber. He was questioned, and crucially, and this is the part that gets left out of the more colorful retellings, he was cleared of the treason. What he was not cleared of was the suspicion of heresy. And in Mary's England, in 1555, that was a very live thing indeed. The burnings had begun in February of that year. Over the reign, close to 300 people would be burned alive for their religion, and it is from this period that the name Bloody Mary comes. Dee was handed over for religious examination to Edmund Bonner, Bishop of London. Bonner is one of the genuinely feared names of English history, the bishop most closely associated with the burnings in the capital. And what happened next is one of the oddest episodes in Dee's life. He was not burned, he was not tortured, he was placed in Bonner's household. And within a remarkably short time, he was not a prisoner in that household, but a member of it, assisting Bonner in the examination of other suspected heretics. Historians have gone back and forth over this for a long time. The unkind reading is straightforward. Dee saved himself by turning and helped send other men towards the fire. The kinder reading, and it has real evidence behind it, is that Dee was a Christian of a peculiar and somewhat detached kind, whose actual religious passion was directed at something above and behind the confessional quarrel. Protestant, Catholic, these were, to a man who believed the deep structure of creation was mathematical and unified, arguments about the surface. He conformed under Edward. He conformed under Mary. He conformed under Elizabeth. He never seems to have suffered much over it. There is a third possibility, which is simply that he was 28 years old and terrified, and did what most people do when the alternative is being burned alive. The records do not let us choose between these with confidence. I would rather tell you that honestly than hand you a verdict I cannot support. What is certain is that he came out alive in 1555, and that this experience taught him something he applied for the rest of his career, which was how narrow the ground is between being valued and being destroyed. And then, having been arrested and examined and released, John Dee did something remarkable. In January of 1556, he presented Queen Mary with a formal proposal. It is usually called the Supplication for the Recovery and Preservation of Ancient Writers and Monuments, and it is one of the most far-sighted documents produced in 16th century England. Dee's argument was this: the dissolution of the monasteries had scattered the written inheritance of the kingdom. Priceless manuscripts were being destroyed daily, sold abroad, cut up, lost. Every year that passed, more of it went. What the crown should do, urgently, was to send commissioners across the country to locate what survived, to borrow it, to have it copied by skilled scribes, and to gather the copies together in a single national collection, open to scholars, preserved permanently, and constantly enlarged by the purchase of important works from abroad. He was proposing a national library. More than that, he was proposing a national library on the modern model, with an acquisitions policy, a copying program, and a mandate for preservation. He was proposing it in 1556. The British Museum, from which the British Library eventually grew, would not be founded for another 197 years. Mary's government said no. There were reasons. Money, mostly, and a government preoccupied with reconciling a country to Rome. Perhaps also a certain wariness about the man making the request, whom they had recently had in custody. And so John Dee, having failed to persuade the crown to build a national library, went away and built one himself. That decision is the pivot of his whole life. Everything that made him remarkable and everything that ruined him grows out of it. He did not have the resources of a state. He had a modest house, a small income, a network of friends, an enormous appetite, and about 50 years. He very nearly managed it anyway. But we are ahead of ourselves, and there is no hurry. Let the year turn. Mary is ill through 1558, and by autumn, everybody at court knows what is coming, and everybody is quietly calculating, including a mathematician in his early 30s who has kept in touch with a princess. Breathe out slowly. The reign that made him is about to begin. Mary Tudor died on the 17th of November, 1558. Elizabeth was 25 years old. She had spent her adolescence in genuine danger, at one point imprisoned in the Tower, under suspicion of conspiring against her sister. She had survived by being extremely careful about what she said, extremely good at appearing to agree, and extremely patient. And now she was queen of a bankrupt, divided, militarily weak country, with a Catholic rival across the water in Mary Queen of Scots, a hostile Spain, an uncertain France, and a religious settlement to construct that would satisfy people who had been burning each other alive for a decade. Almost the first thing she needed was a date, not a small thing. The coronation is the moment the monarchy becomes legitimate in the eyes of God and the realm. It is a piece of theater with theological weight. In a kingdom that had just changed religion 4 times in 25 years, getting it right mattered enormously. And the question of when to hold it was, in the 16th century, a technical question with a technical answer. You would want a day when the heavens were favorable. Everybody thought so, not just the credulous. Everybody. To pick the date of a coronation without consulting the stars would have seemed, to an educated Elizabethan, roughly as irresponsible as building a bridge without consulting an engineer. Robert Dudley, Dee's former pupil, released from the Tower, and now very close indeed to the new queen, knew exactly who to send for. John Dee was asked to elect the coronation date. He did the calculations. He gave his answer. The 15th of January, 1559. And on the 15th of January, 1559, in Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth Tudor was crowned Queen of England. She reigned for 44 years. Under her, the English defeated the Spanish Armada, established the beginnings of overseas empire, and produced Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spenser, Byrd, and Hilliard. It is remembered as a golden age, and while the people living through it would have described it rather differently, with the plague and the harvest failures, and the wars in Ireland, and the constant fear of invasion, it was without question the making of England as a power, and the date on which it began was chosen by an astrologer. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the sort of fact that gets waved about in a certain kind of documentary, and I would rather give you the truth in its proper shape. This does not mean the stars made Elizabeth great. Obviously, what it means is more interesting than that. It means that the state apparatus of Tudor England, the most sophisticated government the country had yet possessed, routinely incorporated astrological calculation into serious decisions, and that the man who performed those calculations was one of the best educated mathematicians in Europe, and that nobody at the time saw any tension whatsoever in this arrangement. That is the world Dee lived in, not a world of ignorant people believing silly things. A world where the boundaries of legitimate knowledge ran along completely different lines than ours, and where the men doing the most rigorous work available were doing it inside a framework we no longer share. Dee's reward for choosing the coronation date, incidentally, was not a salary. He was given, over the following years, various small church livings, the odd payment, and a great deal of goodwill. He asked, repeatedly, for something permanent. He asked for a stipend, for a college position, for an endowment for his work. Elizabeth was famously, notoriously, reluctant to part with money, and Dee was never a priority. What he got instead was access. The Queen came to see him. That is not a small thing either. Elizabeth visited Mortlake more than once, on one occasion riding out with her retinue, and, finding that Dee's wife had died only hours before, tactfully staying outside and asking him to bring his glass out to her at the church wall so she could see it in the open air. On another visit, she came specifically to see the library. She called him, according to Dee's own record, her philosopher. He gave her advice on all sorts of things over 4 decades. On the appearance of a great comet in 1577, when the court was frightened, she summoned him, and he spent 3 days explaining it. On a wax image of the Queen found in Lincoln's Inn Fields with a pin through its breast, an object that badly alarmed the Privy Council, Dee was consulted and appears to have calmed the situation, which in practice meant persuading powerful men not to panic. On the reform of the calendar, on her legal title to foreign lands, on the health of the realm and on her own, he was, in effect, the scientific advisor to the Crown, at a time when there was no such post and no such word. And in between, he went home to Mortlake, to the house beside the river, and he read. We should go there now and look at what he built, because it is the thing he would most want you to remember him for. Let your breathing slow. We are going into the library. Mortlake was a village on the south bank of the Thames, upriver from London, close enough to reach the court by boat and far enough to be quiet. Dee's mother owned a house there, and he took it over and then did what obsessive collectors always do, which is expand. He bought or absorbed neighboring cottages. He knocked through. He added rooms. Over the years, the building became a warren, a house that had grown by accretion around a collection rather than a collection housed inside a building. At its height, it held, by Dee's own catalogue, around 3,000 printed books and about 1,000 manuscripts, 4,000 items. I need to give you something to measure that against, because on its own it sounds modest. We live in a world where 4,000 books is a keen private reader with a large sitting room. The University Library at Cambridge at the time held a few hundred volumes. Oxford's was in an even worse state. The old university library there had been effectively destroyed during the Edwardian Reformation, its books dispersed, and the shelves themselves sold off. What would become the Bodleian was not opened until 1602. So John Dee, working with no institutional money whatsoever, out of a converted house in a village in Surrey, assembled a library that was very probably the largest in England, and certainly the largest and most wide-ranging library any individual Englishman had ever owned. And it was not a trophy collection. This is important. He read them. We know he read them because a great many of his books survive in libraries around the world today, and they are covered in his handwriting. Notes in the margins, corrections, cross-references to other volumes, little pointing hands drawn in ink to mark a passage, arguments with the author. His books are working documents, thumbed and annotated and used, and scholars can trace the movement of his thought across them, like footprints in snow. What was in it? Everything. That is the honest answer. Mathematics, of course, and astronomy and geometry and optics, navigation and cartography, medicine and botany and mineralogy, classical literature and history, theology in enormous quantity, in several languages, law, music, including works on the mathematics of harmony, cryptography, alchemy, astrology, Hermetic philosophy, Kabbalah, books in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic in translation, French, Italian, Spanish, German, and Welsh, and manuscripts rescued from the wreck of the monasteries. Roger Bacon, above all, whom Dee revered and defended and collected obsessively, the 13th century English friar who had written on optics and mathematics and experimental method and had been remembered by posterity as a wizard, which is a fate Dee might have recognized. Chronicles, medieval English scientific texts, things that would otherwise almost certainly have been lost, and which survive today only because a private individual with no money bought them when nobody else wanted them. He also had the instruments, Mercator's globes, a great sea compass, watches and clocks, cross-staffs and quadrants and astrolabes, a large burning glass, mathematical tables, and laboratories, plural, out at the back, for alchemical work, with furnaces, and he had visitors. This is the part that most changes the picture of him. Mortlake was not a hermit's cell. It was, for perhaps 20 years, the closest thing Elizabethan England had to a research institute. Sea captains came, Martin Frobisher came, and Humphrey Gilbert, and John Davis, and Richard Chancellor, and Stephen Burrough, and later the men around Walter Raleigh. They came to learn navigation from Dee before they sailed, and they came back afterwards to report what they had seen so that the maps could be corrected. Merchants of the Muscovy Company came, courtiers came, Philip Sidney among them, Edward Dyer, Christopher Hatton, Walsingham, Burghley. Foreign scholars came, some of them traveling to England largely to see it. Antiquaries came, mathematicians, instrument makers, physicians, and Dee let them in. He lent his books, sometimes to his cost. He made his collection available at a time when institutional libraries chained their volumes to the desks. Try to picture an evening there. It is autumn, the tide is out, and the river smells of mud. Inside, in a low room with beams, there are books on shelves and books in piles, and books open on the table, weighted flat. There are candles, because there is no other option, and the light is warm and unreliable and moves. A globe stands in the corner, with half the world still guessed at. Somewhere a clock ticks. There are 5 or 6 people in the room, some of them among the most interesting men in England, and they are arguing about whether there is a passage to Asia over the top of Russia, and one of them will be dead of scurvy within 3 years, and none of them knows it. That is the room. Hold it, because in a while, we are going to have to watch it broken open and emptied, and you should know what was lost. The house at Mortlake no longer exists. There is a plaque and a road, and the river, which is the only part of the scene still there in its original condition. If you stand on that bank at night, the water moves exactly as it moved for him. Let that image stay a moment, the dark water, the light in the window. Why did a man like this appear when he did? There is a temptation to treat great minds as weather, as though they simply occur, and nothing much can be said about why one century produces a crowd of them and another produces none. But in Dee's case, the answer is fairly clear, and it is mostly to do with a machine. Around 1455, in Mainz, Johannes Gutenberg printed a Bible using movable metal type. Within 50 years, there were printing presses in more than 200 European towns. Within a century, something in the region of 200 million books had been produced. Before Gutenberg, a book was a manuscript, copied by hand over months, and the total book stock of Europe was perhaps a few 100,000 volumes, almost all of them in religious houses. Dee was born 72 years after the Gutenberg Bible. He belonged to the first generation of scholars in human history, for whom it was possible, in principle, to own the conversation. That is what his library actually represents. Not eccentricity, opportunity. For the first time, a private individual with determination could assemble under one roof the mathematical work of Greece, the astronomy of Alexandria, the optics of the Arab world, the medicine of Italy, the cartography of the Low Countries, the theology of Germany, and the chronicles of his own country, and read them against one another. Nobody in the ancient world could have done that. Nobody in the 12th century could have done that. It became possible, roughly, in Dee's lifetime, and he was among the first to see what it made possible and to act on it with his whole life. And into that new capacity poured something else. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453 drove Greek-speaking scholars west into Italy, carrying manuscripts, texts that had been effectively unavailable in Western Europe for 800 years, came back into circulation. Plato in the original, Greek mathematics, Greek medicine, the whole Hellenistic library, partial and battered, arriving in a Latin West that had spent centuries working from summaries and translations of translations. The movement that grew up around recovering, editing, and studying these texts is what we call humanism, and it is worth being precise about the word, because it did not mean then what it tends to mean now. It did not mean secularism or unbelief. Almost all the humanists were devout. It meant the study of the humane letters, the ancient authors, in the best available texts, in the original languages, with proper attention to what they actually said, rather than what medieval commentary had decided they said. And it carried a conviction that was quietly explosive. The conviction was this: that the ancients knew things we have forgotten, that the present is not the summit of knowledge but a depleted remnant of it, that somewhere behind us, in Egypt or Greece or the early church, or the wisdom of Solomon, there stood a body of understanding far greater than anything now possessed, and that it might be recovered. Look again at John Dee with that in mind, and he becomes entirely coherent. He is not a crank collecting oddities. He is a man executing a program. The program is recovery. Find the fragments, assemble them, compare them, restore what was known. And he applies exactly the same method to Euclid, to Roger Bacon, to alchemy, to Hebrew mysticism, and, eventually, to angels. In his own mind, these are not different projects. They are the same project applied to different regions of a single lost inheritance. That belief is also, incidentally, the great intellectual trap of the Renaissance. And Dee walked straight into it, as many did. If you are certain that the ancients possessed a wisdom greater than yours, you will tend to believe old texts too readily and test them too little. The corrective, the insistence that a claim must survive experiment regardless of who made it or how ancient it is, was still assembling itself. It arrived properly with the generation after Dee's death. There were other engines turning at the same time. There was money. Antwerp, then Amsterdam and London, were building a commercial economy of a new kind, with credit, insurance, joint stock ventures. Long voyages were becoming financeable, and a financeable voyage creates demand for accurate navigation, which creates demand for mathematics, which creates a market for men like Dee. There was competition. Portugal and Spain had divided the newly encountered world between them under papal authority. England, arriving late, poor and Protestant, needed both the technical means and the legal argument to break in, and there was fear. This is the part people often miss about the 16th century. It was not a confident age. It was an age of plague, of religious war, of prophecy and portent, in which many serious people expected the end of the world within their lifetimes. The new star of 1572, which blazed in Cassiopeia, where no star had been and should not have been possible in an unchanging heaven, and the great comet of 1577 terrified educated Europe. Something was happening. The heavens themselves were changing. The old certainties were visibly failing. When the world seems to be ending, people go looking for hidden knowledge. All of that is the soil John Dee grew in. A flood of newly available books, a conviction that ancient wisdom was recoverable, money for voyages, a state that needed technical advantage, and a widespread sense that the age was extraordinary and possibly final. Any one of those alone, and you get a scholar. All of them together, and you get John Dee. There is no need to hold any of this. It will still be here in the morning if you want it, and the story goes on regardless. In 1564, in Antwerp, John Dee wrote a very short book in 12 days, and then spent much of the rest of his life insisting that almost nobody had understood it. It is called the Monas Hieroglyphica, the hieroglyphic monad. It runs to about 50 pages. It is written in dense Latin. It consists of 24 theorems built around a single symbol, which Dee had designed himself, and which he believed contained, in compressed form, the structure of the entire created universe. The symbol is not complicated to describe. There is a circle with a dot at its center, which is the sun. Around and above it, a crescent, which is the moon. Beneath them, a cross. And beneath the cross, the sign of Aries, drawn as two half circles, standing for fire. Sun, moon, elements, fire. Dee's argument, laid out theorem by theorem, is that all the signs of the planets can be derived from the components of this single figure by combination and rotation, that the cross can be read as the four elements and as the number 10 in Roman numerals, and as the letters L, V, and X, arranged to spell lux, light. That the proportions of the figure encode musical and numerical relationships. That the same structure appears in the heavens, in the composition of metals, in the letters of the alphabets, and in the soul of the person contemplating it. In other words, that reality is written in a single code, and that this glyph is the key. Now, what do we do with this? The unhelpful response is to laugh. It is easy to laugh. A man draws a doodle and declares it the secret of the cosmos. The more useful response is to ask what he thought he was doing, because when you do, something recognizable appears. Dee is looking for unification. He is looking for a single underlying formalism from which astronomy, chemistry, mathematics, and metaphysics all fall out as special cases. He believes the universe is not a heap of separate subjects, but one thing, coherently constructed, and that the right notation would make its unity visible. That impulse did not die with him. It is, stripped of the 16th century clothing, the impulse behind every attempt at a unified theory in the 4 centuries since. The dream of an equation short enough to print on a card that generates the world. Dee simply believed the notation would be geometric and symbolic rather than algebraic, which was a perfectly reasonable belief in 1564, given that the algebra had not been invented yet. He was also doing something else, and it is the reason the book still fascinates people. He was writing in code, not metaphorically. Dee was seriously interested in cryptography, as were many people around him, and the Monas is written to operate on multiple levels at once. The surface is a philosophical treatise. Underneath, according to Dee, there is more, available only to a reader who already possesses certain keys. He says so explicitly. He complains that the learned men of Europe read it and understood the shell and missed the kernel. Whether there is in fact a hidden layer, and what it says, is a question that has occupied a very peculiar branch of scholarship for a long time, and I am not going to pretend to you that it has been settled. Some serious historians think the concealment is real and largely alchemical, describing a laboratory process in veiled language, which was standard practice in alchemical writing. Others think Dee was doing what many mystical authors do, which is to hint at depths that keep the reader working. It is genuinely hard to know. What is not in doubt is that the book was taken seriously by people who mattered. Dee dedicated it to Maximilian II, the Holy Roman Emperor. He presented it. It was read across Europe. It went through further editions. Elizabeth herself, on Dee's account, asked him to explain it to her, and he says he did, and that she promised to be his patron in the study of it. Whether she understood a word of it we shall never know, but the Queen of England sat down with her philosopher and had the monad explained, and its influence outlived him in a way he could not have predicted. The symbol appears again in the early 17th century in the Rosicrucian literature, printed in the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, which is a strange enough afterlife for a 50-page book of theorems. From there it entered the whole underground river of European esoteric thought, and it is still being drawn today by people who have never heard of Elizabethan navigation, on the covers of books and the sleeves of records, and occasionally on skin. Dee thought it was his masterpiece. He said so, more than once, with feeling. Not the navigation, not the geometry. That tells you something important about him, and it is something we tend to resist, because we would prefer our proto-scientists to value the parts of their work that turned out to be useful. He did not. He thought the mathematics was the doorway. He thought this was the room, the candle gutters and steadies. There is a long silence in the house at Antwerp, and a man in his 30s, setting down his pen, 12 days after picking it up, entirely convinced that he has just written down the shape of everything. 6 years later, John Dee wrote something that actually did change England, and it was an introduction to somebody else's book. In 1570, a London merchant and scholar named Henry Billingsley published the first complete translation of Euclid's Elements into English. Think about what that means practically. For nearly 2,000 years, the foundational text of geometry had been available only to men who could read Greek or Latin, which is to say, to men who had been to university, which is to say, to a tiny, wealthy, almost entirely clerical fraction of the population. A shipwright could not read Euclid. A gunner could not read Euclid. A surveyor, a mason, a mapmaker, a carpenter, a mill builder could not read Euclid. After 1570, in England, in English, they could. Dee wrote the preface. It runs to some 50 pages, and it is, by common agreement among historians of English science, the single most influential thing he ever published. What he wrote was an argument, and the argument was fierce. He argued that mathematics is not an ornament of learning, but the foundation of the useful arts. That it belongs to everybody who works with quantity and form, which is to say, most of the productive population of the kingdom, and that England's neglect of it was a national failure that was costing the country dearly. And then, he did something nobody had done in English before. He set out a map of the mathematical arts, naming and defining them, many of them for the first time in the language. He gave us the word mathematician in something close to its modern professional sense. He set out geometry and arithmetic, and then all the applied disciplines that branch from them. Perspective, the science of vision and optics, astronomy, music, treated as a mathematical science of proportion, cosmography, the description of the earth in relation to the heavens, astrology, which he defined narrowly and carefully as the study of celestial influence, and which he insisted must be built on calculation rather than tradition, statics, the science of weight, anthropography, the proportions of the human body, trochiliké, the study of circular motions, helicosophy, spirals, pneumatismi, the behavior of air and water under pressure, menadry, the multiplication of force, which is to say mechanics, hypogeody, the mapping of what lies underground, for mines, hydragogy, the conveying of water, horometry, the measurement of time, zoography, drawing and painting understood mathematically, architecture, navigation, and what he called thaumaturgike, the making of marvelous works by natural means, into which category he placed his flying beetle, still defending it 24 years later. Some of those words did not survive. Several of those disciplines did, and are now departments in universities. The tone of the preface is what strikes you, though. It is not a scholar showing off. It is closer to a manifesto. Dee is addressing what he calls the unlatined and the common artificer, and he is telling them, in effect, this knowledge is yours. It has been kept from you by an accident of language. Here it is. Use it, and the country will be better for it. For a man who spent his career seeking the patronage of the powerful, that is a genuinely democratic instinct, and it had consequences. The Billingsley Euclid went through further editions. It sat in the hands of practical men for generations. The English mathematical practitioners of the 17th century, the surveyors and navigators and instrument makers, whose competence underwrote everything the country later did at sea, grew up in a world Dee's preface helped to make. There is a passage in it, though, that shows you the whole man rather than the useful half of him. Having laid out this rational program, Dee turns and defends himself, at length and with obvious hurt, against the charge of being a conjurer. He complains about the slanders. He insists that what he does is natural philosophy and mathematics, that marvels produced by mechanism are not magic, and that his countrymen are too ignorant to tell the difference. And then, in the same document, he writes about numbers in a way no engineer ever has. He describes number as existing in three realms: the divine, the mathematical, and the physical. He writes of a mystical arithmetic beyond the ordinary sort. He grounds the whole edifice of practical mathematics in a metaphysics in which numbers are the thoughts of God, and to calculate is to trace, faintly, the reasoning of the Creator. That is not a contradiction he has failed to notice. That is his actual position. The reason mathematics works on ships and bridges, in Dee's view, is that mathematics is the language reality was written in. The applied arts are not separate from the mystical arithmetic. They are its shadow, cast into matter. We separated those two things later, and we were right to, and the separation was enormously productive. But we should not pretend that Dee was confused, or that he was a modern scientist with unfortunate superstitions attached. He had a coherent worldview. Ours is a different one. His produced, among other things, the first English Euclid, and the first serious argument in the language that ordinary working people should be taught geometry. The house is quiet. Outside, the tide has turned, and the river is running the other way now, as it does twice a day, on a schedule he could have calculated for you. Now let us go down to the water, because this is where John Dee's abstractions met salt. In 1553, 3 ships left England to look for a northeast passage, a route to Asia over the top of Russia. The venture was organized by the merchants who would become the Muscovy Company, and it was, in the plainest terms, a gamble by a country locked out of the profitable routes. Spain and Portugal held the south. The papal division of 1493 and the treaty that followed had carved the unexplored world between them, and while England did not accept the legal position, it could not challenge the naval one. The Cape route to the Indies was Portuguese, the Americas were Spanish. If England wanted a share of the eastern trade, it would have to find a way there that nobody was guarding. North, then, over the top. The theory, as it was understood, had a certain elegance. Above a certain latitude, in summer, the sun does not set. Perpetual sunlight, over months, ought to prevent the sea from freezing. Somewhere up there, therefore, was open water, and beyond it, warm seas and China. It was wrong. It was reasoned and coherent, and completely wrong, and it killed a great many men. John Dee was consulted on that first voyage, and on most of what followed for the next 30 years. His role was concrete and technical. He instructed the pilots. He taught them the geometry they needed, the use of the cross staff and the astrolabe for taking the altitude of the sun, and the pole star, the methods for reducing an observation to a latitude, the handling of tables. He wrote out sailing directions. He drew charts, some of which survive. He advised on instruments and, in some cases, designed them. And he was doing this at a moment when English navigation was, to be blunt about it, primitive. An English master in the 1540s navigated by soundings, by the color and smell of the seabed brought up on tallow, by known landmarks, by a compass, and by long memory. That works beautifully for the Channel, the North Sea, and the run down to Iberia. It does not work at all in the middle of an ocean. Ocean navigation is a mathematical problem, and England did not have the mathematics. The Spanish and Portuguese did. They had schools of pilots, official cosmographers, examinations. England had captains who had learned from other captains. Dee was one of the small handful of men who imported the mathematics and taught it. Richard Chancellor, who piloted that first Muscovy voyage and reached the White Sea and traveled overland to Moscow, worked with Dee. Stephen Burrough, who took a ship further northeast than any Englishman before him, was close to him. Martin Frobisher and his pilot Christopher Hall came to Mortlake before the voyages of the 1570s. John Davis, who made 3 voyages into the northwest in the 1580s and gave his name to the strait between Greenland and Baffin Island, was a neighbor and a friend of Dee's. Humphrey Gilbert consulted him. Walter Raleigh's Circle consulted him. Adrian Gilbert and John Davis sat down with him at Mortlake in 1583 to plan a northwest venture. This is not a footnote to Dee's career. For 25 years, he was the technical brain behind English oceanic exploration, and the results, in the short term, were grim. Hugh Willoughby, commanding that first expedition, was separated from Chancellor in a storm, wintered on the Kola Peninsula, and was found the following year frozen to death with his entire crew. Frobisher made 3 voyages to Baffin Island, was convinced he had found gold, brought home over 1,000 tons of black ore in a huge and expensive operation, and it turned out to be worthless rock. Investors were ruined. Gilbert claimed Newfoundland for England in 1583 and drowned on the way home. The Northwest Passage was not navigated by anyone until the early 20th century, in a small ship, over 3 winters, by Roald Amundsen, and it was of no commercial use whatsoever. Everybody who went north looking for a quick route to China was wrong, and yet, the voyages produced coastlines. Every failed expedition came back, when it came back, with observations, soundings, sightings, sketches, corrections. That knowledge went into the charts, and the charts went into other ships. The men trained for those voyages became the officers of the next generation. The investment structures assembled to finance them, the joint stock companies, became the mechanism by which England eventually did reach the East, going the long way round, through the Cape, and founded the East India Company in 1600. The failure built the capability, and there is a harder thing to say alongside that, which I am not going to skip. The capability was used. The navigation that Dee taught, and the legal arguments he supplied, were the front edge of something that over the following 3 centuries became the largest empire in history, and was for a great many people on the receiving end, a catastrophe. Enslavement, dispossession, famine, the destruction of societies that had existed for thousands of years. Dee did not do those things. He died in poverty in 1608, and the empire he imagined was a trading and maritime commonwealth rather than the thing that actually came. But he supplied tools and arguments, and the tools and arguments were taken up, and it seems to me dishonest to describe him as a founder of British sea power without saying what British sea power turned out to mean. He is one of the places where the story of knowledge and the story of power run into each other and cannot be pulled apart. That is a heavy thought for this hour of the night. Let it go for now, if you like. It will keep. The tide is still turning. We are going to talk about a phrase. In 1577, John Dee published a book with a very dull title, General and Rare Memorials, pertaining to the perfect art of navigation. It was intended as the first volume of 4, and the other 3 were never printed, and one of them was suppressed, and one Dee later claimed to have burned. What was published looks, at first glance, like a technical argument for a stronger navy. It is not, quite. On the frontispiece there is an engraving that Dee designed himself, and it is one of the strangest pieces of political imagery produced in Tudor England. A ship rides at sea. Elizabeth sits in it, at the helm, crowned. On the shore, a female figure representing Britain kneels, hands raised, imploring her. An angel with a drawn sword leads the vessel on. There are stars and letters and a scattering of symbolic detail that scholars have been unpicking for a century. The message is not subtle. The Queen holds the rudder. The direction is outward. Heaven approves, and inside the book and in the manuscripts Dee prepared alongside it, he used a phrase, the British Empire. He is generally credited with coining it, or at the very least with being the first to use it in the sense we now mean, as a description of a dominion of the English crown, extending beyond the British Isles and across the sea. He wrote it as a British Empire. He wrote it in Latin as Britannici Imperii, in the title of a work he presented directly to the Queen and her Privy Council, the Britannici Imperii Limites, the limits of the British Empire, a set of documents prepared in the late 1570s, which lay in an archive unnoticed until they were identified in 1976. So the phrase that came to name a quarter of the earth was invented by a mathematician and astrologer in a book about navigation to persuade a reluctant queen to build ships. What was the argument? Dee's case had 2 legs, one practical and one legal, and it is the legal one that is extraordinary. The practical leg was simple. England is an island. Its strength must be at sea. It needs a standing navy, permanently maintained rather than assembled in emergencies, funded by a tax, capable of protecting fisheries and trade, and deterring invasion. He proposed a specific establishment of ships and men. He argued that command of the surrounding seas was not an ambition, but a necessity. 11 years later, the Spanish Armada came, and while the fleet that met it was not the fleet Dee had described, the principle he had argued for, that England's security was a naval question and required permanent investment, was thoroughly vindicated and became the settled doctrine of the country for the next 3.5 centuries. The legal leg was where he had to be inventive. The problem was this: Spain and Portugal claimed the newly encountered world by right of papal grant and prior discovery. England, if it wanted a share, needed to argue that some of those lands were already, in law, the Queen's. So Dee went into his library and built a case out of history. He argued that King Arthur, whom he treated as a historical monarch, had conquered lands to the north and west, including Iceland, Greenland, and territories beyond, and that the title had descended to the English crown. He argued that Madoc, a Welsh prince of the 12th century, had sailed west and reached and settled a land across the Atlantic, and that Welsh-speaking descendants might still be found there, and that this constituted a prior claim to North America, predating Columbus by 300 years. He argued from the voyages of St. Brendan and from various northern traditions. He assembled genealogies connecting Elizabeth, through her Welsh Tudor ancestry, to these ancient British kings. Almost none of this is true. Arthur, if he existed at all, was a post-Roman warlord, of whom we know essentially nothing, and certainly did not conquer Greenland. The Madoc story appears in no source before the 15th century, and is now regarded as a Welsh literary tradition, greatly amplified in the Tudor period, for precisely the political reasons Dee was applying it to. But truth is not really the point. The point is what the argument was for. Dee had grasped something that would matter enormously. Empires require legal justification, not just force. Force alone is unstable and invites resistance from other powers. What you need is a story about why the land is already yours, which converts conquest into recovery and invasion into the assertion of a right. Spain had the Pope. England could not use the Pope, so England needed something else, and Dee gave it a mythology and a legal theory, arguing from natural law, from the law of nations, and from prior title, that the Queen might lawfully claim lands discovered by her subjects and not currently held by another Christian prince. That framework, refined by lawyers over the following century, is very close to what the English actually used. Elizabeth, characteristically, was interested and cautious. Burghley, her great minister, was alarmed by the scale of the ambition and the risk of provoking Spain, and applied the brake. The Memorials was withdrawn from circulation. Dee's vision was received, admired in some quarters, and shelved. He got no money for it. He did not get a single grant of land, or a share in any venture, or a pension. He gave England the phrase, the argument and the navigation, and he went home to Mortlake to worry about his household expenses. There is one more piece of his public work to look at before we go inward, and it is the one where he was most obviously right and most completely ignored. Let your eyes close if they have not already. We are going to talk about time. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII reformed the calendar. The problem was old and well known. The Julian calendar, inherited from Rome, assumed a year of 365 and a quarter days. The actual solar year is about 11 minutes shorter. 11 minutes a year sounds like nothing. Over 16 centuries it amounts to a drift of 10 days, and by the 1500s, the calendar had slipped so far that the spring equinox, which the Church needed in order to fix the date of Easter, was falling on the 11th of March rather than the 21st. The Gregorian reform cut out the excess days and adjusted the rule for leap years. It is the calendar you are living in tonight, and it is accurate to within about a day in 3,000 years. Elizabeth's government asked John Dee to advise on whether England should adopt it. He produced a detailed treatise. His conclusion was that reform was necessary and correct. He proposed a scheme for England, adjusting by 11 days rather than the Roman 10, on the grounds that the Julian era should be measured from the birth of Christ rather than from the Council of Nicaea, which was a defensible and arguably more elegant position. He suggested spreading the correction over a period to soften the disruption. He worked out the arithmetic carefully. Burghley approved. The Privy Council was in favour. The Queen was willing. And then the bishops of the Church of England refused. Not on astronomical grounds. Nobody disputed the astronomy. They refused because the reform had come from Rome, and to accept a papal calendar was to concede the Pope's authority over the ordering of Christian time, which was precisely what the English Reformation had denied. So England did not reform its calendar. For the next 170 years, England and its colonies ran on a different date from most of continental Europe. If you sailed from Dover to Calais in the 17th century, you arrived, on paper, 10 days in the future. Diplomats wrote both dates on their letters. Historians of the period still have to specify which style they are using. Britain finally adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1752, cutting 11 days out of September, which is exactly the correction Dee had proposed 170 years earlier. He was right. He was ignored, and the country eventually did what he had said, long after he was dust. There is something so representative about that episode that it is almost too neat. His other scientific work runs in the same channels. He wrote on optics, following Roger Bacon and the Arab tradition, on the behavior of light through lenses and mirrors, on the burning glass, on the geometry of vision. He wrote on the tides, which for a country of sailors was intensely practical work. He observed and wrote about the new star of 1572, the one that appeared in Cassiopeia, and blazed for months and then faded, and which we now know was a supernova. Tycho Brahe observed the same object and used it to demonstrate that the heavens above the moon were not, after all, changeless, which quietly destroyed a piece of physics that had stood since Aristotle. Dee and his pupil Thomas Digges measured its parallax independently and came to the same conclusion. That is not a small thing. Digges, who had been taught by Dee after his own father's death, went on to publish a diagram of the Copernican universe, with the stars scattered outward without limit, one of the first serious representations of an infinite cosmos in English. Dee's teaching runs directly into that. Dee had Copernicus in his library and annotated him. He did not, as far as we can tell, commit himself publicly to a moving Earth, which was a live and dangerous question. He was interested and cautious. He worked on the geometry of the burning mirror. He made tables. He designed instruments. He was consulted on mines and on the assaying of ores. He wrote on the reformation of geography, on the placing of coastlines correctly on the globe. And he did all of it inside a single project, which he would not have divided the way I have just divided it for you. That is the thing I keep coming back to, and I want to say it once clearly before we go into the stranger territory. We have inherited a habit of sorting John Dee's activities into a good pile and an embarrassing pile. The Euclid preface goes in the good pile. The angel conversations go in the embarrassing pile. Navigation, good. Alchemy, embarrassing. And then we say, what a shame that such a fine mind was corrupted by superstition, as though a healthy scientist had been infected by something. He would not have recognized that division at all. To Dee there was one subject. The subject was the nature of creation, which was made by God according to number, weight, and measure, and which could therefore be approached mathematically at the level of the physical world, alchemically at the level of matter, astronomically at the level of the heavens, and, if one were pure enough and fortunate enough, directly at the level of the intelligences that governed the whole arrangement. The geometry was not separate from the mysticism. The geometry was the first flight of stairs. He climbed them in order, and where he ended up, in a locked room with a crystal and a man with cropped ears, was not a departure from his method. It was, in his own terms, the logical continuation of it. Let your breath go all the way out. We are going to talk about gold now, and what it really meant. Almost everything you have been told about alchemy is a caricature. The caricature is a greedy old man in a smoky cellar, trying to turn lead into gold, failing, and eventually being replaced by chemistry, which was the same thing done properly. Let me offer you a better picture, because if you understand what alchemy actually was, half of John Dee's supposed strangeness dissolves. Start with the physics, because the physics is the key, and nobody ever mentions it. In the 16th century, the accepted theory of matter was Aristotle's, refined over 18 centuries. All substances were composed of 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire, mixed in different proportions and qualified by the 4 qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry. There were no elements in our sense. There were no atoms in any usable sense. There was no periodic table, no concept of a chemical element as an irreducible substance, and no reason on earth to think that iron and gold were fundamentally different kinds of stuff. They were, in the accepted theory, the same underlying matter in different states of purity and perfection, and metals were believed to grow, slowly, over ages, in the ground, ripening from base towards noble, from lead through iron and copper and silver towards gold, which was the perfected end of the process. Mines were sometimes left fallow to let the ore recover, on the assumption that it would regenerate. Now, if that is your physics, transmutation is not a fantasy. It is an engineering problem. Nature turns lead into gold already. It simply takes 10,000 years. The alchemist proposes to accelerate a natural process in the laboratory, exactly as a gardener accelerates growth in a hothouse. What is required is the right agent, the catalyst, which they called the stone, or the tincture, or the powder of projection. That is not stupid. Given the premises, it is entirely rational. The premises were wrong. It took the work of Boyle and Lavoisier and a great deal else to establish that they were wrong, and to replace them with something better. But the alchemists were not fools reasoning badly. They were competent people, reasoning well from a false theory, which is a description that will one day be applied to a great deal of what we currently believe. And while they were doing it, they built chemistry. They developed distillation and refined the apparatus for it. They isolated and described the mineral acids, sulfuric, nitric, hydrochloric, which are among the most important substances in industrial history. They worked out sublimation, crystallization, calcination, filtration. They made phosphorus, discovered in the 17th century by an alchemist, boiling down vast quantities of urine in search of the stone. They developed pigments, medicines, glass, metallurgy. They kept detailed laboratory records. They insisted on doing rather than merely reading, and in an age of textual authority that insistence mattered enormously. The vessels, the furnaces, the procedures, and much of the vocabulary of the modern laboratory came out of alchemy. Isaac Newton, who invented calculus and described gravitation, wrote more words on alchemy than on physics, and was still doing it in the 1690s. But there was another dimension, and this is the one that mattered most to Dee. Alchemy was never only about metals. The transformation of base matter into gold was understood, by its more serious practitioners, as one instance of a universal principle of purification. The same process, they held, could be applied to the body, producing medicines and perhaps extending life. And it could be applied to the soul of the practitioner, who could not, according to the whole tradition, succeed at the work while remaining impure himself. The alchemist was not merely operating on the substance in the flask. He was operating on himself. The two processes were held to be the same process seen from different sides. The language, therefore, is deliberately double. When an alchemical text describes the death of the king and his resurrection, or the marriage of the sun and moon, or the black stage giving way to white and then to red, it may be describing a laboratory sequence, or an inner transformation, or both at once. And the writers frequently intended all three readings to hold simultaneously. They also wrote in code on purpose, partly because the knowledge was held to be dangerous in the wrong hands, partly because transmutation was illegal in England for a long stretch, since a working transmutation would debase the currency, and the crown took a dim view. Partly, one suspects, because obscurity conceals failure rather well. The result is a body of literature that is nearly impossible to read straight, in which green lions devour the sun, and dragons eat their own tails, and everything means something else. Dee had shelves of it. He had laboratories at Mortlake with furnaces, and he ran them. He owned and annotated the alchemical classics. He was known across Europe as a serious student of the art, and he approached it as he approached everything, as a search for the underlying unity, the single process behind the many appearances. He never claimed, as far as I can find, to have made gold himself. He would spend years, however, in the company of a man who claimed exactly that, and that association would cost him almost everything he had. The furnace ticks as it cools. There is a particular quality to a room that has been hot all day, and is now going quiet. Before we meet that man, there are two more streams of thought we need to follow, because without them nothing Dee did in the last 30 years of his life will make any sense at all. In 1462, an agent working for Cosimo de' Medici brought a Greek manuscript to Florence. Marsilio Ficino, the great Platonist scholar, was at that moment part way through translating the complete works of Plato into Latin, which was itself an event of enormous importance. Cosimo, who was dying, told him to put Plato aside and translate the new manuscript first. That tells you how much they thought it was worth. The manuscript contained a collection of Greek treatises attributed to a figure called Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great, understood to be an ancient Egyptian priest and sage, a contemporary of Moses or older, from whom, it was believed, Plato and Pythagoras had ultimately derived their wisdom. Ficino translated it. It was printed. It swept across educated Europe. The Corpus Hermeticum, as the collection is known, is a set of philosophical and mystical dialogues concerning God, mind, matter, the soul, and the way of ascent. Its tone is contemplative and lofty. It teaches that the human mind is divine in origin, that it has descended into matter, and that through knowledge it may ascend again and come to know God directly. And it appeared to be far older than Christianity while agreeing with it. That was the electrifying part. Here apparently was a pagan Egyptian writing centuries before Christ, who spoke of a single creating God, of the Word, of the divine mind. To Renaissance thinkers, this looked like proof of an ancient theology, a primordial revelation given to humanity at the beginning and preserved in fragments across all the wisdom traditions, of which Christianity was the fullest flowering, but not the only witness. If that is true, then studying Egyptian and Greek and Hebrew mysteries is not heresy. It is archaeology of the truth. The whole occult philosophy of the Renaissance rests on that idea. There is a problem, and it is a very large one, and it did not surface until 15 years after John Dee died. In 1614, a scholar named Isaac Casaubon, working on the Greek, demonstrated that the Hermetic texts could not possibly be ancient Egyptian. The vocabulary was wrong. The philosophy was drenched in Platonism of a distinctly late variety. There were echoes of the Greek Bible. The style belonged unmistakably to the first 3 centuries after Christ. The Corpus Hermeticum was not older than Moses. It was later than the Gospels, which means the entire structure was built on a dating error. The reason Hermes agreed with Christian theology was not that he anticipated it. It was that he came afterwards and had absorbed the same intellectual atmosphere. Remember Casaubon's name. His son, Merrick Casaubon, is going to do something to John Dee's reputation that has never been undone. But in Dee's lifetime, none of this was known, and Hermes was a colossus. The doctrine that mattered most, and which runs through everything Dee touched, is compressed into a single line from the Emerald Tablet, a short and famously cryptic text attributed to Hermes and enormously influential in alchemy. As above, so below. 4 words, and an entire way of seeing. The claim is that the universe is built on correspondence. The great world and the small world, the macrocosm and the microcosm, are structurally the same. The pattern of the heavens is repeated in the structure of the earth, in the composition of metals, in the organs of the body, in the faculties of the human soul. The sun in the sky corresponds to gold in the ground, to the heart in the body, to the reason in the mind, and all of these are expressions of one principle, appearing at different scales. If that is true, then the world is not a collection of separate things. It is a single text, written in a repeating pattern, and to read one part correctly is to gain access to all the others. Now look at John Dee again. His Monas Hieroglyphica is a working out of exactly this. One symbol containing the structure of everything, because everything shares a structure. His astrology is this: celestial pattern reproduced in terrestrial event. His alchemy is this, cosmic process reproduced in a flask. His mathematics is this, the divine reason reproduced in number. And his eventual attempt to speak with angels is this too, an attempt to reach the level at which the pattern is legible in its original form. He is not doing several unrelated things. He is doing one thing, over and over, at every scale he can reach. Whether the doctrine is true is a separate question, and I think you know my view. There is no evidence for correspondence of this kind, and the history of science is in large part the history of discovering that things which look alike are frequently not alike at all. But as a way of experiencing the world, it is not contemptible. It produces a universe that is dense with meaning, in which nothing is inert and nothing is accidental, and in which the attentive person is surrounded by significance rather than by matter. There are worse frameworks to live inside. Ours is more accurate and, on certain nights, considerably colder. There is one more stream to follow, and then we can meet Edward Kelly. It concerns language, and the possibility that some words are not arbitrary. Consider a fact about ordinary language that is so familiar it becomes invisible. The word for a tree is different in every language, and none of them is more correct than the others. Arb, Baum, Koiden. The sound has no relationship to the thing. It is a convention, agreed by accident over centuries, and it could have been otherwise. Words are arbitrary. This is one of the foundations of modern linguistics. Now consider what follows if it is not true. If there existed a language in which the name of a thing was not arbitrary, in which the word was somehow bound to the nature of the object, then to speak that language would not be to describe the world. It would be to touch it, and to know the true name of a thing might be to have power over it. This idea is very old and extremely widespread, and in the tradition that reached John Dee, it came in a particular form. In Genesis, God creates by speaking, "Let there be light." The world is not built, it is uttered. And Adam, in the garden, is brought the animals and gives each of them its name. And the text is careful to say that whatever Adam called each creature, that was its name. Read literally, and Dee read it literally. This means that the language Adam spoke was not a human invention. Its words were the true names, given by a mind that understood the things it was naming, in a tongue that God himself had used to make them. And then that language was lost. At Babel, according to the account, human speech was confounded and scattered into the mutually unintelligible tangle we have now. So somewhere behind all our languages, in Dee's understanding, stands a lost original, the speech of creation itself. Alongside this ran the Jewish mystical tradition, the Kabbalah, which had developed over centuries in Spain, Provence, and elsewhere, and which took the letters of the Hebrew alphabet with a seriousness that is difficult to convey briefly. In that tradition, Hebrew is not one language among others. Its letters are the elements from which creation was assembled. Each carries a numerical value, and because it does, every word carries a number, and words sharing a number may share a hidden relationship. Methods were developed for working with this. Gematria, the calculation of numerical values. Notarikon, the treatment of a word as an acronym concealing a sentence. Temera, systematic permutation of letters. And there is the structure of the tree of life, the 10 Sephirot, the emanations by which the infinite and unknowable God becomes a finite world. This was, and is, a serious religious discipline pursued by learned Jews within a demanding devotional life. What happened in the Renaissance was that Christian scholars, most notably Pico della Mirandola in the 1480s, took hold of it and pulled it into an entirely different frame. Pico argued that the Kabbalah, properly understood, actually demonstrated the truths of Christianity and could be combined with Hermetic philosophy, Platonism, and natural magic into one great synthesis. The result, usually called Christian Kabbalah, to distinguish it from the Jewish tradition it borrowed from, spread rapidly. Johannes Reuchlin wrote on it. And in 1533, Cornelius Agrippa published the 3 books of occult philosophy, which gathered the whole system, astrological, numerical, angelic and ceremonial, into a single vast compendium. Agrippa's work was, more than anything else, the practical handbook of Renaissance magic, and John Dee owned it and read it and annotated it. Now put the pieces together, because they lock. If reality is built on correspondence, as Hermes teaches, and if the divine reason expresses itself in number, as the Pythagoreans and Dee's own preface to Euclid maintain, and if there existed a language whose words are true names given at creation, then the recovery of that language would not be a linguistic curiosity. It would be the master key. You would be able to name things truly. You would be able to address the intelligences that govern the created order in the speech they actually use. You would have access, in principle, to the operating instructions of the world, and every fragment of it that survives, in Hebrew, in the divine names, in the tables of Agrippa, in the recorded names of angels, would be a piece of a shattered original waiting to be reassembled. This is where John Dee's life bends. Remember the boy who watched the monastic libraries burn and grew up unable to bear the loss of knowledge. Remember the man who tried to persuade a queen to save the manuscripts and, failing, spent his fortune building the library himself. Remember the scholar who by his 50s had read more than almost anyone alive in a house with 4,000 volumes, and who had gone as far as the books could take him. And now understand what he concluded. He concluded that the books were not enough, that everything written down was a copy of a copy, degraded, partial, corrupted by transmission and translation, and the failing memory of the human race. That behind all of it stood an original that no human being now possessed, and that there was only one place left to ask. He was in his 50s. He had exhausted the greatest private library in England. His country had taken his advice and given him almost nothing. He had a wife much younger than himself and a growing family and not enough money, and a reputation as a conjurer that clung to him no matter what he published, and a sense, which comes off his private papers unmistakably, that time was running out and that he had not yet found what he was looking for. So he began to pray, not for wealth, not for favor. He prayed, with tremendous seriousness and at great length, that God would send an angel to teach him what he could not learn from books. He prayed like that for years, and then, in 1582, a young man with a badly damaged reputation and something wrong with his ears knocked at the door of the house at Mortlake. Settle deeper. The candle is very low now. This is where the story turns strange, and I will keep telling it in the same quiet voice. Dee had tried before, and it had not gone well. He was not himself a scryer. He could look into a crystal for as long as he liked, and see nothing but a crystal, which he found frustrating, and which he recorded honestly. The practice as it was understood required a second person, a scryer or seer, whose sight was of the appropriate kind, who would look into a polished surface and report what appeared there, while the scholar directed the proceedings and wrote it down. His first regular seer was a man named Barnabas Saul, who worked with him in 1581 and into 1582, and who then recanted, telling Dee that he had seen nothing and heard nothing, and that it had all been imagination. That should have ended matters. It did not. In March of 1582, a man arrived at Mortlake calling himself Edward Talbot. His real name was Edward Kelly. He was about 27, a Worcester man, apprenticed at some point to an apothecary, educated to a point, sharp, restless, and possessed of an imagination of remarkable power. He wore a close-fitting cap at all times, which he never removed. The common report, then and since, was that this concealed the fact that his ears had been cropped, the standard punishment for forgery or coining, and that he had been convicted at Lancaster. That report may be true. It may be a slander that attached itself to him afterwards. He certainly had legal trouble in his past, and there were darker stories, one of which had him digging up a recently buried corpse in a Lancashire churchyard to question it about a legacy, a story that appears in a source written decades later and cannot be verified, and has followed him ever since. This is the man John Dee let into his house, and I want to be fair to Dee here, because it is very easy to make him look like a fool. He was cautious. He tested Kelly. He was aware of the possibility of fraud, wrote about it, worried about it, and repeatedly took the matter to prayer. He knew about Saul's recantation. He was not a naive man, but he was a man who had been praying for years for exactly this, and who now had in front of him someone who could apparently do it, because Kelly could do it, whatever it was. Kelly sat down at the table on which stood the crystal, and he looked, and he began to speak. And what came out of him, session after session, year after year, was not vague. It was not the sort of mumbling you might expect. It was a torrent of highly specific, richly visual, internally consistent material. Figures appeared and described themselves. They gave names, they gave elaborate instructions, they dictated tables of letters, hundreds upon hundreds of them, cell by cell, in a grid, which is an almost inconceivably laborious thing to fabricate, and which Kelly did repeatedly. They dictated a language. They argued with Dee, they rebuked him, they set conditions, they went silent and had to be coaxed. They contradicted themselves, and then explained the contradictions. Dee wrote it all down. That is the crucial fact, and it is the reason we can discuss any of this at all. He kept meticulous records of every session, with dates and times and the words as nearly verbatim as he could manage, over 7 years, filling volumes. Those manuscripts survive, most of them in the British Library, and you can read them. Try to see the room. It is late. A small chamber at Mortlake, the shutters closed. There is a table, and on the table a construction Dee had made to angelic specification, the Holy Table, with sigils and characters set into it, and beneath its legs 4 wax seals, and upon it a seal of wax about 9 inches across, engraved with a design the voices had dictated. That seal survives. It is in the British Museum, and you can stand in front of it, and it is smaller than you expect. On the table is the stone. Dee had more than one. There was a crystal globe, which he recorded as having been brought to him by an angel in a shaft of light through the window, and there was a mirror of polished black obsidian, Aztec work, brought back from Mexico in the aftermath of the Spanish conquest, and reaching England by some route we cannot now trace. That mirror is in the British Museum too. It is about 7 inches across, dark and cloudy, with a handle. Looking into it is like looking into standing water at night. You see a suggestion of your own face, and behind it, nothing that resolves. Kelly sits before it. Dee sits a little apart, at his own table, with paper and ink. There is 1 candle, or perhaps 2, because too much light kills the effect. And then Kelly says, "There is a figure standing at the western window," and Dee begins to write. They did this for 7 years. Whatever else is true, hold on to the strangeness of the arrangement. One of the most learned men in Europe, the Queen's philosopher, the author of the preface to Euclid, sitting night after night in a small dark room, taking dictation from a young man with a criminal past, who was describing things that only he could see, and the older man believing him, almost entirely, for years. The house is very still. Do not try to decide yet what was happening in that room. We are going to look at what they produced, and it is stranger and more interesting than either the believers or the debunkers usually admit. What did the angels actually say? The first thing to understand is that Dee did not think of this as magic, and would have been offended by the suggestion. He thought of it as prayer that had been answered. He was not summoning anything. He did not command. The sessions open with lengthy prayers, in Latin and in English, of a thoroughly conventional Christian kind, asking God in His mercy to send His ministers to instruct an unworthy servant. When the voices rebuked him for pride or impatience, he accepted the rebuke and wrote it down. When they demanded that he fast, or pray more, or destroy certain papers, he generally complied. His posture throughout is that of a devout, anxious, obedient man who believes he has been granted something he does not deserve. The beings had names. Michael and Gabriel appeared, and Uriel and Raphael. But most of the work was done by others less familiar. Nalvaj, who dictated a great deal of the language, Galva, Ave, Il, and Madimi, who appeared first in 1583 as a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, in a gown of green and red velvet, playing, and who came and went across the years, growing older, and whose role in the story ends very badly indeed. They gave at first an enormous quantity of what can only be described as system. Tables of letters, 49 by 49, dictated cell by cell, not in order. The voices would frequently give the letters by their positions, out of sequence, so that the grid could only be assembled afterwards, which is a peculiar way to fabricate something, and which Dee took as evidence of authenticity. These became the Book of Lowergaith, which survives in Kelly's handwriting. Then, between the spring of 1583 and 1584, they dictated something else. 48 invocations, or calls, in a language with its own alphabet, its own grammatical behavior, its own vocabulary, together with English translations. Dee and Kelly called it the angelical, or the Adamic speech, the language of Eden. Later occultists called it Enochian, after the biblical patriarch Enoch, who walked with God and was taken. And here we arrive at the genuine puzzle, the one that has kept serious people arguing for a very long time. The language is odd. Linguists who have examined it disagree, and I am going to represent that disagreement honestly, rather than telling you what you want to hear. It has a phonology that does not obviously match English. It has some apparent grammatical structure. Its word order in the translated calls follows English rather closely, which is suspicious. Its vocabulary shows no clear relationship to Hebrew or Greek or Latin, which is what a forger of the period would most likely have reached for. Certain analyses have found statistical properties in the letter distribution that are difficult to produce deliberately. Others have found exactly the sort of inconsistencies you would expect from invention. The mainstream scholarly position, and I think the correct one, is that it is a constructed language, produced by Kelly, whether consciously or not. But even that assessment leaves you with something remarkable. If Kelly invented it, then a 27-year-old with no linguistic training produced, under pressure, in real time, in front of a hostile expert who was writing everything down and checking it, one of the earliest constructed languages in European history, with an alphabet, a lexicon, and a workable syntax, and did so consistently, across years and across 2 countries. That is not the achievement of a simple fraud. It is a strange and considerable feat, whatever it is. The content of the messages changed over time, and the change is worth noticing. In the early years, it is largely instructional. Make this table, draw this seal. Write down these letters, purify yourself. The material has the character of an initiation, a curriculum being delivered. Later, it becomes apocalyptic and political. The voices speak of the end of the age, of judgment, of the fall of kingdoms. They begin to comment on European affairs. They advise Dee to leave England. They tell him to go to a particular nobleman. They instruct him to deliver warnings to specific monarchs. They discuss the Turks, the Pope, the wars of religion. And later still, they become erratic, demanding, and finally destructive. Now, what was happening? Let me lay out the possibilities plainly, because I think you deserve them all rather than the one that makes the best television. The first is deliberate fraud. Kelly invented everything for money, patronage, and a comfortable position in the household of a famous and well-connected man. There is real support for this. Kelly benefited materially. The messages repeatedly steered towards things Kelly wanted, and the final message we shall come to steered towards something he wanted very much indeed. He tried more than once to leave, and each time was persuaded or paid to stay. The second is that Kelly believed at least some of it. Scrying with a reflective surface in low light is a documented method of inducing hypnagogic imagery, and susceptible people can experience it as genuinely external and involuntary. Kelly may have begun in fraud and drifted into something he no longer controlled, or begun sincerely and later embellished under the pressure of Dee's expectation. He told Dee at various points that he thought the spirits were evil and wanted to stop, which is not obviously the behavior of a confident conman. The third is that both men were engaged in something more like a collaborative trance, sustained over years by two people locked in an intense mutual dependency, in which the material was generated by a process neither of them had access to, and neither could honestly have called lying. The fourth is the one Dee held, and I record it because he held it, and because a documentary that pretends the historical actor's own view does not exist is not doing its job. He believed angels were speaking. He believed it to the end of his life. We cannot settle this. The manuscripts do not contain a confession or a proof. They contain 7 years of two men in a small room, and whatever was in that room went with them. Rest your eyes. The candle is nearly out, and I am going to let it go out, because they are about to leave England, and after that, there is very little candlelight in this story for a long time. In the spring of 1583, a Polish nobleman came to England. Albert Laski, Palatine of Sieradz, was flamboyant, heavily in debt, deeply interested in alchemy, and looking for something that would restore his fortunes, and perhaps put him on the throne of Poland. He was entertained at court, taken to Oxford and shown off, and somebody, probably Robert Dudley, brought him to Mortlake. Laski met Dee, then he met Kelly, then he sat in on a session, and the voices, on cue, told him that he was destined for great things, that he would be a king, that he had been chosen for a role in the coming transformation of Europe. He invited them to come back with him to Poland, all of them, wives, children, servants. Dee consulted the angels about whether he should go, and the angels, who had already been telling him for some time to leave England, said yes. On the 21st of September, 1583, John Dee locked up his house, left the greater part of his library behind, took some 800 printed books and nearly 100 manuscripts, which required 4 coaches to carry, and departed with his wife Jane, their children, Edward Kelly, Kelly's wife Joanna, and the rest of the household. He was 56 years old. He would not see England again for 6 years, and when he did, everything would be gone. It is worth stopping here, because this is the decision that destroyed him, and it deserves to be looked at properly. Why did he go? Partly, honestly, because he was being told to by the only source of authority he now trusted more than his own judgment. Partly because his position in England had become difficult. His reputation as a conjurer had never faded, and his ordinary sources of income were failing, and his repeated petitions to the Queen had produced sympathy and very little money. Partly because Europe was where the patrons were. Rudolph II in Prague and Stephen Bathory in Poland were known to spend freely on alchemists and natural philosophers, and a man with Dee's reputation might reasonably expect to be well received. And partly, I suspect, because he was 56 and had not found what he was looking for and could feel the years going. The journey across Europe took months, through the Low Countries and into the German lands, in winter, with children. It was miserable. They reached Poland and stayed at Lask, and then at Krakow, and the sessions continued. Lasky turned out to have no money. This became clear fairly quickly. The great patron who was to fund everything was himself running from creditors, and the prophecies of his royal destiny quietly stopped being mentioned. So they went to Prague. If you want to understand the last strange chapter of John Dee's life, you have to understand Rudolf II, because there has never been another court quite like his. Rudolf was Holy Roman Emperor, King of Bohemia and Hungary, head of the Austrian Habsburgs, and by temperament, entirely unsuited to any of it. He was melancholic, reclusive, and increasingly unwilling to make decisions. He moved the imperial capital from Vienna to Prague, and then withdrew into the castle, sometimes refusing to see his ministers for months. What he did instead was collect. His Kunstkammer was one of the great collections of the age. Paintings, including Dürer and Bruegel and Arcimboldo, who painted the emperor as an assemblage of fruit, clocks and automata, scientific instruments, gemstones and minerals, narwhal tusks, sold as unicorn horn, fossils, curiosities from the New World, whole rooms of it, catalogued and guarded, and rarely shown. And he collected people. Tycho Brahe came to Prague as imperial mathematician, and Johannes Kepler came to work under him, and it was in Prague, on Tycho's observations, that Kepler worked out the laws of planetary motion, which is one of the foundation stones of modern physics. That happened at this court. And alongside them, Rudolf's Prague filled up with alchemists, some serious, most not. There was a street of them below the castle. The emperor funded laboratories and read the literature himself, and was, by all accounts, sincerely obsessed with transmutation and with the prolongation of life. Into this arrived an elderly English mathematician and a young English scryer. Dee obtained an audience with the emperor in August of 1584, and what he did with it tells you everything about his sincerity and nothing at all about his political sense. He did not offer alchemical services. He did not flatter. He delivered a message from the angels, which was, in substance, that the emperor was a sinner, that God was displeased with him, that he must repent and reform his life, and that if he did so, he would be given a power greater than any monarch had ever held, and if he did not, he would be cast down. You do not say that to a Holy Roman Emperor. Rudolf, to his credit, was polite. He listened. He said something non-committal, and then he did not see Dee again, delegating him to officials who kept him at arm's length for month after month. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church was paying attention. The papal nuncio in Prague made formal representations against the two Englishmen as suspected conjurers, and the pressure built through 1585 and into 1586. In May of 1586, an imperial decree expelled them from the Habsburg lands. They had 6 days to go. They were rescued by a Bohemian magnate. Wilhelm of Rosenberg, usually anglicized as Rosenberg, was one of the wealthiest men in Central Europe, High Steward of the Kingdom of Bohemia, and interested in alchemy. He took them in and installed them at his castle at Trebon, in southern Bohemia, on the edge of a landscape of artificial fish ponds his family had spent generations digging. For a time, it was the most comfortable existence they had known since leaving England. Rosenberg was generous. There were laboratories. There was money, and in December of 1586, according to Dee's diary, Edward Kelly performed a transmutation. Kelly had, some years earlier, come into possession of 2 powders, one red and one white, together with a manuscript, which he claimed to have obtained from a ruined abbey in Wales. The story varies in the telling. What is not in doubt is that Kelly now began to demonstrate, in front of witnesses, the conversion of base metal into gold, and people believed him, not credulous peasants, wealthy, educated, skeptical men who had seen alchemists before and had every reason to test the claim. Rosenberg believed him. Rudolf, eventually, believed him. Reports went across Europe. Burghley in England read them and wrote asking whether Kelly might be persuaded to come home and make gold for the Queen, which is a sentence I would not believe if the letters did not survive. Kelly became rich. He was granted estates. He was ennobled, made a knight, given the style of Sir Edward Kelly of Imany. He owned houses and land in Bohemia. The emperor took him into service. How did he do it? Almost certainly by conjuring in the ordinary theatrical sense. A crucible with a false bottom, a stirring rod hollowed out and plugged with wax, and filled with gold dust that ran out when the wax melted. Gold dissolved in a liquid and added to the mixture. These methods were well known and had been catalogued by skeptics for centuries. The trick works because the audience is watching the fire and not the hands, and because they very much want it to work. But Kelly kept it up for years, in front of experts, under conditions he did not always control. That takes remarkable nerve, and it eventually took him somewhere he could not get out of. And as Kelly rose, Dee sank. This is the pivot of their relationship. In England, Dee had been the famous one, and Kelly the useful assistant. In Bohemia, Kelly was the man who could apparently make gold, and Dee was an elderly foreigner whose usefulness was less obvious. The emperor wanted Kelly. Rosenberg wanted Kelly. Dee found himself in the background of his own life, and Kelly wanted to stop. He had been saying so for a while. He told Dee that the sessions exhausted him, that he doubted the beings, that he suspected they were not angels at all, but something malicious. He tried to break away and take up alchemy full-time. Each time, Dee begged him to continue, and each time he was drawn back. Then, in the spring of 1587, Kelly reported a new instruction. Madimi appeared. The child who had first come in green and red velvet 4 years earlier had grown, in the visions, into a woman. And the message she delivered was that Dee and Kelly must henceforth hold all things in common, everything they possessed, including their wives. Dee's reaction, recorded in his own hand, is one of the most painful things in the whole archive. He was horrified. He argued. He prayed. He asked for the instruction to be repeated and confirmed. He wrote of his grief and his confusion, and then he obeyed. On the 22nd of May, 1587, the four of them signed a covenant. Dee's diary records that his wife Jane, on being told, wept and trembled for a quarter of an hour before consenting to what her husband told her was the will of God. Jane Dee was in her early 30s. She had left her country, crossed a continent, borne children in foreign towns, and followed her husband's visions for 4 years. And this is what it came to. 9 months later, she gave birth to a son. Dee named him Theodorus Trebonianus Dee, the gift of God, of Treboni, and raised him as his own. There is no way to make this episode acceptable, and I am not going to try. Whatever one concludes about Kelly's motives, and the most straightforward conclusion is the ugly one. The person who paid for it was a woman whose consent was extracted through a chain of authority she could not argue against. It broke them. Dee never quite says so, but the sessions decline after this. The old obedience is gone. Within months, the partnership was disintegrating, and by early 1589, Dee had decided to go home. They separated. Dee left Bohemia in the spring of 1589 and traveled back across Europe with his family, a journey that took months. Rudolf, for all his ambivalence, provided a safe conduct. The two men never met again. Kelly's end was bad. He remained in Bohemia, rich and celebrated, and then the emperor, having invested heavily and received nothing, ran out of patience. Kelly was arrested and imprisoned, released and imprisoned again. The accounts of his death are confused, as accounts of Kelly always are, but the traditional story is that he died around 1597 or 1598 after being injured, attempting to escape from confinement. He had made himself a knight of the empire out of nothing but nerve and a story, and it killed him. Let that settle. The next part is quieter and sadder, and it takes place mostly in the rain. He came home in December of 1589, and he went to Mortlake. The house had been broken into. The details are recorded in Dee's own petitions, written afterwards in an attempt to obtain redress, and they make hard reading. Something in the region of 500 books had gone. Manuscripts had gone, including irreplaceable medieval works. His instruments had been taken or smashed. A great quadrant destroyed. Mirrors and lenses broken. The magnetic compass gone. His laboratory equipment ruined. Some of it had been taken by a brother-in-law who had been left in charge. Some by neighbors and local people. In the months after Dee's departure, when a rumor went round that the conjurer had fled the country, some of it had simply been sold. Books from that library are scattered today across the Royal College of Physicians, Christ Church, Oxford, the British Library, Trinity College, Cambridge, the Bodleian, and collections in America. You can identify them by his handwriting. The greatest library in England had been picked over like a wreck on a beach. He spent years trying to recover his property, with limited success. He wrote petitions. He listed what had been taken. He named names. He got some books back, and a small amount of compensation, and never anything like restitution. And he was, by now, poor, genuinely poor, in a way that is difficult to convey. He was selling possessions to buy food. He wrote to Elizabeth describing his condition and asking for help several times over several years, in language that becomes progressively less proud. In 1592, commissioners were appointed to look into his affairs, and he laid out his career before them, everything he had done for the crown over 40 years, and asked for a settled income. What he was eventually given, in 1595, was the wardenship of Christ's College in Manchester. It sounds respectable. It was, in practice, a punishment. Manchester was then a modest northern town, far from the court, far from London, far from anybody Dee could talk to. The college was a collegiate church with a warden and fellows, and it was in a state of chronic dispute over money, discipline, and religion. The fellows resented an outsider. Dee had no experience of running such an institution, and no appetite for it. The income was contested and irregular, and the region was in the grip of a witchcraft panic. Dee, of all people, was asked to examine cases of alleged demonic possession, and did so with notable restraint and skepticism, which is quietly to his credit, and did nothing for his standing. He hated it. His diary from these years is a record of small humiliations, illness, money troubles, and homesickness. Then, in 1604, the plague came to Manchester and to London. Jane Dee died of it. So did at least one of their children. Dee, in his late 70s, was left with the household broken. He went back to Mortlake, to what was left, and he lived out his last years there, in the care of his daughter Catherine. Elizabeth had died in 1603. The new king was James I, who had written a book called Daemonologie, who took witchcraft with the utmost seriousness, and who had no interest whatsoever in an ancient scholar with a reputation for conjuring. Dee petitioned James. He asked, remarkably, to be put on trial. He wanted the charge of conjuring examined formally, so that he could clear his name, and he offered to accept the death penalty if he were found guilty. It is an extraordinary document, the request of a man who has spent 50 years being whispered about, and who wants, finally, to be told what he is accused of. James did not reply, and so John Dee, who had chosen the coronation date of a queen, who had trained the captains that mapped the northern seas, who had given England the phrase British Empire, who had written the preface that brought geometry into the English language, sold his books one by one to buy bread. He died at Mortlake, in poverty, at the age of 81, in December of 1608. or possibly in March of the following year. Even that is uncertain, and there is evidence that his death may have occurred in London at the house of an acquaintance. The parish register for the relevant period does not survive. The grave is not marked. The church at Mortlake stands, and he is thought to be somewhere in or near it, and nobody knows exactly where. There is a plaque now, put up in the 20th century. That is what he ended with. A plaque, and 400 years of argument. Let the rain fall on that scene for a moment. It is worth sitting with. The boy who could not bear the loss of knowledge lost his own library to thieves. The man who assembled the greatest collection in England could not afford to keep it. The scholar, who wanted only to be believed, died with a reputation for fraud and was buried in an unrecorded grave. If the story ended there, it would be simply sad. It does not end there. What happens to John Dee after his death is almost as strange as what happened to him during his life, and in some ways, it is stranger because it is still happening. Stay with me. There is not much further to go, and the last part is gentler. In 1659, 50 years after his death, a scholar named Merrick Casaubon published John Dee's Angel Diaries. The title was long, and the intention was clear: a true and faithful relation of what passed for many years between Dr. John Dee and some spirits. Casaubon presented the manuscripts more or less as he found them, and prefaced them with an essay arguing that Dee had been a devout but deluded man who had been deceived by demons, and that the book stood as a warning against exactly this kind of inquiry. The son of the scholar who had demolished Hermes Trismegistus now demolished John Dee. It worked. It worked completely. For the next 300 years, if an educated Englishman knew anything about John Dee, he knew that Dee was the man who thought he talked to angels. The mathematics vanished. The navigation vanished. The Euclid preface vanished. The man who had proposed a national library became a footnote in the history of credulity, the standing example of a clever man ruined by superstition. Casaubon meant it as a caution. What he had actually done, though, was publish the material, and the material got out. Something else had happened in the meantime. In 1614, and the years immediately following, 3 anonymous documents appeared in Germany announcing the existence of a secret brotherhood dedicated to the reformation of learning and religion, founded by a mysterious figure called Christian Rosenkreuz. Nobody has ever satisfactorily identified who wrote them. They caused a sensation across Europe and produced a flood of responses, and the movement they claim to describe almost certainly did not exist as an organization, which did not prevent people from spending the next 400 years trying to join it. In one of those documents, the Chemical Wedding, there is a printed symbol. It is the Monus of John Dee. The historian Francis Yates built an influential argument on this and related evidence, proposing that Dee's philosophy, carried into Central Europe during those years in Bohemia, was among the sources of the Rosicrucian phenomenon. Later scholars have qualified her case considerably, and the direct line she drew is now regarded as too confident. But the symbol is there in the text, and however it arrived, Dee's glyph entered the bloodstream of European esotericism and never left. From there, the trail runs forward. Elias Ashmole, founder of the Ashmolean Museum and a serious antiquary, collected Dee's manuscripts in the 17th century and preserved them, which is the only reason many of them exist. Some had been hidden in a secret drawer in a chest, discovered when the chest was sold, and a portion of those was reportedly used by a maid to line pie dishes before the rest were rescued, which is a fate with a certain grim symmetry, given how Dee felt about the destruction of manuscripts. In the late 19th century, the founders of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn took the Enochian material out of the manuscripts and built it into a working magical system, with the elemental watchtowers, the calls, and the angelic hierarchies arranged into a coherent ritual structure. That system passed to Aleister Crowley, who used it extensively, and from there into essentially every strand of modern Western ceremonial magic. Anyone practicing Enochian magic today is working, at several removes, from notes taken by a man in a small room at Mortlake in 1584. The Freemasonry claim you will encounter online deserves a direct answer because it comes up constantly. There is no documented connection between John Dee and Freemasonry. Organized speculative Freemasonry emerges in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, well over 100 years after Dee's death, out of the Scottish and English stonemasons' lodges. Dee was not a Mason, and there is no evidence he had anything to do with the operative lodges. What is true is that some of the intellectual currents Dee swam in, the Hermetic and Kabbalistic and alchemical material, contributed to the atmosphere from which speculative Masonry later drew some of its symbolism, and that Ashmole, who preserved Dee's papers, was one of the earliest recorded gentleman initiates into a Masonic lodge in 1646. That is a real thread of influence. It is not a secret lineage, and anyone telling you Dee founded Freemasonry is telling you a story rather than a history. The same discipline applies to the story that John Dee was a spy who signed his letters 007. It is a wonderful story. It appears in a biography published in 1968 by an author writing as Richard Deacon, who suggested that Dee was Elizabeth's secret agent and the original of James Bond, and that the two circles represented eyes, for the Queen's eyes only, with a 7 added for its mystical properties. The claim spread everywhere and is now repeated as fact on 1,000 websites. The evidence for it is very thin. Historians who have gone through Dee's surviving signatures have not found it. Dee certainly traveled, certainly knew Walsingham and Burghley, certainly reported what he learned abroad, and certainly worked on ciphers, and in that loose sense he was an informant, as many educated travelers were. But the numeral, the code name, and the bond connection belong to the 20th century rather than the 16th. I tell you this not to spoil it, but because the true story is better, and because Dee spent his life being described as something he was not, and it seems only decent to stop doing it. The rehabilitation, when it came slowly. Historians of science in the 20th century went back to the mathematics and found that it was excellent. Historians of exploration went back to the navigation and found how central he had been. Francis Yates and others argued for taking Renaissance occult philosophy seriously as a historical phenomenon rather than dismissing it. William Sherman's work on Dee's reading and his political writings recovered the courtier and the imperial theorist. Nicholas Cluley argued for the coherence of his natural philosophy. The Royal College of Physicians exhibited his surviving books in 2016, and people queued, and there is a portrait, painted around 1600, that hangs at Oxford. Under later paint, X-ray examination revealed something that had been added and then covered over. A circle of human skulls around the figure's head. Somebody, at some point, decided that was how he should be seen. Somebody else decided it should be hidden. That is John Dee's afterlife in a single image. So who was he? I have been putting off answering that, and I think the honest answer is that the question is slightly wrong, and that seeing why it is wrong is the most useful thing John Dee has left us. We want him to be one thing, scientist or magician, genius or fool, founder of the Royal Society's world, or last relic of the medieval one, and he refuses, in every account, to sort himself into either pile, and we find that uncomfortable, and we keep trying. But consider what he was actually standing in. He was born into a world where the heavens were made of a fifth element and moved by intelligences, where matter was 4 elements in proportion, where disease was an imbalance of humors, where the earth stood still, where the ancients knew more than the moderns, and where every educated person understood that the visible world was the outer surface of an invisible order. He died 15 years before Galileo was tried, 40 years before Newton was born, 52 years before the founding of the Royal Society. He lived, in other words, in the last generation for whom the old synthesis was still intact. And he tried, with more energy and more learning than almost anybody, to complete it, to find the single key, to gather the scattered inheritance back into one place and see the whole design at once. He failed. It could not be done, because the thing he was trying to unify was not one thing, and a great deal of what he was working with was simply false. But the failure was not idle. Along the way he taught England its navigation. He put Euclid into the hands of carpenters. He proposed a national library. He named an empire. He trained the men who trained the men who charted the seas. He measured a supernova and got the answer right. He defended the reform of the calendar and was overruled by bishops and vindicated by history a century and a half later. And when the books ran out, he did the thing that we find embarrassing, and that was, in his own terms, the most rational act of his life. He asked, "Here is what I keep returning to about him. Every generation believes it stands on solid ground. Every generation looks back at the last and sees where the floor gave way. Dee's world was as coherent from the inside as ours is from the inside. His premises were carefully reasoned from the best evidence available. His methods were rigorous. His conclusions were mostly wrong. Somewhere in what we currently hold to be obviously true, there is a D-shaped error, and we cannot see it because we are standing on it. That thought is not meant to unsettle you at this hour. It is meant to do the opposite. It is meant as a kind of permission. He did the best work he could with the tools he had, and the tools were not adequate, and the work was not wasted, and the good parts survived him in ways he never got to see. That is not a tragedy. That is more or less the arrangement all of us are working under. And there is one more thing. The pursuit, in his case, was not for gain. He never got rich. He never got a title. He never got the settled income he asked for over and over across 40 years. He was slandered as a conjurer from the age of 19, and he was still writing petitions, asking to be believed when he was 77. He wanted to know. That is all. He wanted to know what the world was made of and how it was arranged and who had arranged it, and he could not stop wanting it, and the wanting cost him his library, his fortune, his reputation, and very nearly his family. Whatever else that is, it is not small. Now let us leave him. It is late at Mortlake. The house is standing in the dark by the river, quiet now, the room's cold. There is a table with a wax seal upon it, and a stone of polished black glass that shows nothing at all. The candle has almost burned down. Watch the flame lean, and steady, and grow small, and go, and the smoke go up in a thin line and disperse. And now there is only the window, and beyond it, the river, moving the way it always moves, patient and enormous, and entirely indifferent to everything that happened in this house. Above the roof, the stars are turning slowly westward, the way they turned for him, the same stars, in almost exactly the same places. Nothing up there has noticed the 400 years. If he walked out into that garden tonight, he would recognize the sky immediately, and he would be able to tell you the hour from it, and he would be right. The tide is going out. The books are scattered across a dozen libraries, and safe, and read. The house is gone. The question he was asking is still open. Let your body go heavy where it is lying. Let your jaw unclench. Let the last of the day go out of your shoulders, and out of your hands, and out of your feet. There is nothing left to follow tonight. No more names, no more dates. No more journeys across a continent in winter. Only the dark water, and the slow turning of the stars, and a candle that has already gone out. Knowledge, curiosity, imagination. They have carried us this far, and they carried him, even when the answers stayed just beyond the reach of his hands. They will carry whoever comes next, and they do not require you to be awake for it. So rest now. Thank you for spending this time with me. Sleep into power, guys. Good night. you.